Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm doing a video on SPAD.neXt, which is a piece of software that I've been using for many years, which is absolutely critical to my sim setup, both in the old form and the current temporary form, and will be critical for the new sim as well. And as I don't really have any other content to share around the sim rebuild, because things are going very slowly, and as the last video randomly flying around in MSFS didn't exactly get the number of views that I was looking for, even by the standards of this channel, I've taken the message loud and clear that what you really want is relevant content to do with building a sim or building a home cockpit, and I think SPAD.neXt really fits the bill here. But if your first question at this point is, what is SPAD.neXt? Well, then this is the video for you. Now, it's worth digging a little way into the past to understand where SPAD.neXt came from and indeed what it is. And to do that, we need to go back to the prehistory, probably as far back as 10 years ago. And remember that at that point there were relatively new pieces of hardware from an outfit called Saitek, who were making yokes and throttle quadrants and a series of interchangeable panel devices which could be mounted together and set up on a desktop to represent radio panels and autopilot panels and switch panels. And whilst they're not exactly flight accurate to any aircraft, they're flexible and they enable people, particularly people who are making their first step from just a regular desktop sim, to get a bit more immersion at relatively low cost. And those devices look a bit like this. So here are the Saytek panels. As you can see, they're still available today, and they add a fair bit of realism to a desktop setup. You could go as far as building some kind of enclosure like this, or you could buy this one from eBay, which mounts a bunch of the panels in a single enclosure that you can play about with. But also, for example, you have this product here, which actually gives you a full-on instrument panel into which you can mount a yoke and pallet. And basically, if you have the entire Saitek kit range, then you could create quite a nice little light aircraft simulator for your desktop just using all of this stuff. So many sim enthusiasts have these panels. I have a switch panel in my cockpit today, and I have at various times owned the radio panel and the multi-panel as well, although I no longer use those. And I also owned a set of the Pro Flight instrument panels here, which are, well, what they look like really. They're small LCD displays on which you could display various different gauges, and we'll talk a bit more about that later because SPAD.neXt actually has some very specific support for them. So these are the Saitek panels, and in order to use these you needed to install the drivers from Saitek. However, there were problems, and they weren't very quick to keep up with new releases of the simulator, and sometimes things would break or not work particularly well. It was always touch and go whether devices would work on USB 3 connections versus USB 2 connections, and generally it was a bit of a pain. And also the drivers were designed to interface directly with the sim of the day, which for Saitek was FSX, and do the things that they expected you to do, but they provided little to nothing in the way of customizability, so you couldn't control what the panels did at any kind of useful level. And from the community came an alternative, and that alternative was called SPAD. So this is what SPAD looked like, and SPAD stands for Saitek Panels Advanced Driver. And basically it was an open source package which replaced the Saitek drivers and allowed you to get more control over these devices. So you can see that you could interface all the various different devices that you had, and then you were able to control the behavior. You could, for example, cause clicking on these controls to execute an FSUIPC command and do something other than what the default would normally be. And this provided an opportunity for people both to get more reliable performance out of their Saitek panels, because this tended to just work, but also allowed them to customize things in a way that you couldn't with the default drivers. However, like all good things that are open source, eventually the author moved on to bigger and better things and was unable to continue supporting it, and the last version that was released was in 2012, so just over 10 years ago now. And in 2014 the author admitted that basically there was going to be no further progress, and actually made the source code for the software open source so that anybody could take it, and he hoped that somebody else would take over maintaining the package. Well, somebody did, but also didn't. And a guy whose handle is Connex, who lives in Switzerland, not that that's relevant for this story, but he does, decided to take it on, but actually to start almost from scratch. I assume he took some of this code, but to start with a new project which he called SPAD.next, or just SPAD.next as we will call it now. And this is the SPAD.next website. So as you can see, it's a bit more modern and a bit more up to date, and it's still very much in active development now, and it's extended its range well beyond the original goal of just creating the Saytek panels. It's now capable of managing pretty much any hardware device that you might have. Now, SPAD.next, unlike the original SPAD, is not purely a free program. There is a trial mode that lets you try out the more advanced functionality, but basically if you want to use it, you're going to need to buy a license. If we actually go to the buy section, you can see there are a number of different license options available. So there is the straightforward MSFS FSX P3D edition. It gives you the basic support for the Sims, and it gives you access to FSUI PC variables and SimConnect and LVARs, and I'll talk more about that stuff later. But it doesn't give you a lot of additional plugins and extra features that you might want if you were, for example, building a full home cockpit. There's an X-Plane edition which works nicely with X-Plane in the same way that the MSFX FSX P3D edition works with those sims. And then there's the Complete edition, which is the one that I have, which basically supports everything and gives you all of the plugins that there are. There's also the Professional edition, which is if you wish to ship that, for example, with a turnkey simulator, then you would need to buy the Professional edition. Now, it's well worth the license cost, I think. I mean, €90 seems like quite a lot of money, and it is, but it's such a vital component of my simulator that I couldn't imagine not being willing to pay that price. And in fact, I paid it more than once because I have more than one setup on more than one computer. And that is worth noting, that your copy of SPAD.next will be bound to a particular PC. You can deactivate the license and move it, but if you want it to run on more than one PC, which I did, you will need to buy more than one license. And I think, given the amount of work that the author is putting into this, I don't think that's unfair. But you can use the free trial to make sure that it's something that would work for you, and I recommend that you do so. Right, so let's go and look at the software itself. So this is the SPAD.next user interface, and it's pretty simple and straightforward. There's a lot of stuff here that, I'll be honest, I don't use, but it is available to you if you want to. So all of the sections in the user interface can be chosen from this bar down the left. You just click on the relevant icon, it will take you to that section. This is the home section, and then within each section there are buttons to the second left which take you down to individual features within that section. So here in the home section you have access to a lot of content which is on their website, but which is available to you here if you don't want to go to their website, like news and video guides is actually worth looking at, because there are a lot of guides to setting up particular pieces of hardware or particular aircraft in Microsoft Flight Sim, and it walks you through a lot of what you need to do in order to get those things working. So definitely well worth watching, and we may come back to some of these things later on. And you can look at the forum and the frequently asked questions, etc. I'm not going to bother going through all of these, but those are there for you if you want them. The next section is for the profile management. So the profiles in SPAD.next are individual sets of controls and customizations that can be applied to one or more aircraft. So profiles have aircrafts assigned to them, and aircraft can belong in more than one profile. Now, I'm not going to go through every different option that you have on these pages because that would take a long time, and to be honest, most of it is pretty self-explanatory, but it's worth noting that you can change the aircraft assignments anytime you want. This page will let you pick the aircraft from the simulator that you've got connected, or indeed more than one simulator if you have more than one simulator working with SPAD.next. And if you click on re-index aircraft, then it will go and add any new aircraft which you've installed into your simulators, and then you then map them into a particular profile. So as you can see, for Microsoft Flight Sim, pretty much all of the aircraft that I fly have been mapped into this particular profile. But if I were to create a custom profile for one of these aircraft, I could take it out of this profile and add it into the new one. Also worth noting, there's a publish button. So the SPAD.neXt author maintains a library of device profiles and aircraft profiles on his website, which you can publish yours into, and you can find ones produced by others. So the online profiles section would let you download relevant profiles for particular aircraft that you have. You might then want to configure those a bit further yourself, but it could get you a good head start depending on which devices you're using and which aircraft you're using. And then you can see which aircraft you've published profiles for. I have not published any profiles, to be honest, particularly not this generic MSFS profile. That would not be of use to most people. So that's profile management. The next section is where the hardware devices start to come in. So this is the panels section, and this is for devices which SPAD.neXt recognizes as a control panel. This is where the old Saitek devices would come in. So for example, you can see my Pro switch panel that I have installed in my simulator right now, but also you'll notice that it's aware of my OpenCockpits MCP version 3, and it actually has a plugin for that installed, and that comes as part of the Complete Edition, which is again another reason why I needed to buy the Complete Edition. You can see it knows about the Pro switch panel, and when it knows about a device you actually get a nice picture of it. It knows about my Stream Deck. Stream Deck support has been added relatively recently to SPAD.neXt, and this is potentially game changing because it allows you to use Stream Deck devices as controls for your simulator. And in my next generation sim, I'm quite likely to be using 2 or 3 Stream Decks as a customizable button panel, which can be customized for each individual aircraft type without needing to physically change labels or do backlighting, for example. So whilst it's not the most visually accurate thing that I could be doing, it will certainly be very easy, and then SPAD.neXt will allow me to control that in a pretty sophisticated manner. There is the script panel. When you turn on support for this, this is always available. It's not a real device, it's a virtual device, and I'll explain a bit more about what you'd use it for as we go through the video. And there is the virtual MIDI. Now I have no idea what the virtual MIDI does. I expect it plays MIDI sounds, but I've never used it, so I really wouldn't know. But most of my activity obviously goes on in the top couple of these. So let's pick one of them and just see a little bit about how we use SPAD to interact with devices and interact with the simulator. So with this picture up, I can click on any of its elements. So for example, let's look at the panel lights switch. You can see it says configured because there's already something bound to it. So this is just a default event. I could obviously customize it, but what you can see is that SPAD.neXt knows when the switch is turned on, it knows when the switch is turned off, and it raises events when those things happen. And then when those things happen, I have programmed certain actions. And in this case, it's just sending a panel lights on event via SimConnect to the simulator, which will then cause the panel lights in the sim to turn on and off. Pretty simple, pretty easy, pretty straightforward, but there are many more things that you can do with this interface. So let's just try adding another event. You've got 3 options. You've got a switched on, switched off, and a scripted event. I'll talk about scripted events in a bit, but let's say we want something else to happen when it's switched on. Now I could add an additional action to that previous event, or I could just add another event. It's fine. You're allowed to add more than one event. This is the event management dialog. Now, when an event happens, you can execute one or more actions, and actions contain all the different things that SPAD can do, like setting a data value, sending a sim event, pressing a key, doing other hardware activities, and a bunch more, which we'll look at in a second. And you can make those conditional on something, and generally speaking those conditions are going to be a data value from the simulator, but it can be other things. So as an example, if we add a condition, it says what is the source, and we get this dialog, which you'll become very familiar with as you use SPAD.neXt. So this lists all of the data values that SPAD is aware of. Now there may be data values that it's not aware of, and there is a way to add them manually later on, which I'll talk about. But it's kept pretty much up to date, and they have pretty much everything for all the major sims. As you can see, I have quite a lot of categories down the left-hand side, so you can filter by those categories. I've got, for example, support for Wilco aircraft, which actually I don't need because I have none of them and never have done. But we've got a SimConnect section, we've got an MSFS 2020 section, LVARs, you know LVARs are local variables in the sim. Local values are things which you configure yourself in SPAD against the profile, so you could create temporary placeholder variables, for example. FSUI PC gives you access to the FSUI PC offsets, and then events give you access to custom events. And again, we'll talk about those a little bit later. But let's say that we want this to act on something coming from MSFS 2020. We can actually drill into that a bit more and say, okay, we want to change the cabin lights based on something electrical. So, for example, when the electrical system goes off, you would want the cabin lights to go off. Now, in the simulator, that would happen anyway, but for example, if you were controlling an external device, then you might want the lights on that device to change, and you could do that this way. So if we look at, say, the master battery as an example, when the master battery is changed, so double click on that. So what's the condition? The condition would be when the master battery has gone to 0, in other words, when it's switched off. If that's the case, then we can add an action that we want to do. And here are the different actions that you can have. So change a data value in the sim, that's pretty straightforward. Send an event to the sim, again, that's a SimConnect event. Pretty straightforward. These generally apply to the Stream Deck, so you can change the color of a button or the image that's on it or label. But other devices which have colors, images which are supported by SPAD.neXt, you could do that there. LED color change, if you have devices with LEDs in, for example, my switch panel has LEDs in the gear light, or if you've added an LED control card that SPAD.neXt is aware of, then you could do that from here. Button lights and modes, so for example on my OpenCockpit MCP, the buttons have lights which can be toggled on and off independently. You could play a sound, you could speak some text with the Windows text-to-speech system. You could just cause the sim to pause. You could send a keyboard command. The advanced menu has a bunch of other things. You can turn the virtual power to a device on or off. That might not be a bad thing for us to be doing here. You could move to the next page or the next gauge on the device. For example, on the Stream Deck you can have multiple pages. You could change the digit marker on your transponder. You could emulate an event, trigger a remote event, send the message. There's lots of things you can do, and I'm not going to go into the full detail of all of these things. You'd need to do the research when you have SPAD.neXt set up, but it's very, very flexible. It can do an awful lot of things, and also if you add your own plugins via scripting, then you'll be able to execute a script. And if you have VJoy, the virtual joystick software installed, you could send a virtual joystick key press as an example. You can already send FSUI PC joystick buttons, for example. And then lastly, you have the external or output option, so you could use it to send a REST command or a URL, call a URL to do something. I can't think of a use case where I'd want to use that, but I'm sure there are use cases where you might. But in this case, we're just going to say that when the master battery goes off, I want to turn off the virtual power on my OpenCockpits MCP. So here I'm going to go device virtual power off and say that the target device is my MCP, and we'll say OK, and that will do that. So when when you switch the panel lights on, if the master battery is 0, it will power off the MCP. It's a very contrived example. You wouldn't do this in the real world, but it gives you an example of how you can do that. And you know, actions that change the data values, you need to pick the data value and then specify what the value would be, etc. It's all pretty self-explanatory. Let's just cancel out of that because we don't want to change any of that stuff. It already works. So let's just talk about the scripted event that I mentioned earlier on, and then that'll bring us on to the script panel, which I briefly mentioned earlier. When you create a scripted event, it's a little bit different from an event based on, for example, a switch being turned on or off. And in fact, in order to trigger that event, you must have a condition. So this can't be unconditional. So we could add a condition. So, for example, let's say the one that we had before, when the master battery switch goes to 0, then we want to do something, and we would add an action there, and that would happen when the master battery value goes to 0. And you don't need any other event to have happened. In the previous example, that would only have been evaluated when you actually changed the position of the switch. In this case, it will be evaluated continuously, and as soon as this value changes, then this action will be executed. And we can put that here under this device if it's relevant to that device, or if we want to collect it somewhere else because it's not strictly relevant to any of the devices themselves, that's where the script panel comes in. Now, for whatever reason, the graphic for the script panel here looks like the Saitek Annunciator panel, or the BIP, but it's not. Don't get this confused. If you had a BIP installed, you would see that separately. But here, you can click on one of these Annunciator lights, and you can add scripted events into there. So you can add a conditional action or a scripted event. So conditional action is just a simpler version of a scripted event. So you add the condition there, you add the action there, and it does exactly what we just saw, which is when that condition is matched, then it will actually run whatever actions you have in this box. That's one place you can put scripted events. I used to use that in my prepared sim, so that when various state elements changed in the aircraft based on LVARs, like for example in the Embraer E-Jets, there were various things that would change in terms of LVAR state which didn't reflect a SimConnect change in the sim, but I did need to react to or change the state of something else in response to, and the script panel was a good way of doing that. And as with most things, you have this online snippets button, and it's launched the window on the wrong monitor. Let me just bring that up. And you've got various different snippets that people have added to the library, so it's well worth having a browse through some of those to see what is available that could be useful for you. Right, so that's the panels section. Actually, the one other thing I will show you since I'm here is there's a device settings button. You can change the name of the device if you don't like what it's given you, and I should do that for a couple of mine actually. You can remove the device from the profile altogether. There, I'm not quite sure what summary does. Oh, create documentation. Oh, great, okay. Didn't even know about that. You would normally have a profile level settings and a global level settings for the device. Obviously this is not a real device, so if we go to the Pro Switch panel, you actually now have that settings. Right, let's move on to the next section, which is the control section. And this is where you find all the hardware which is not a control panel of some kind, but which is connected to your computer. And you can see it's picked up pretty much all of the USB devices that I have, many of which at the moment are actually mapped through the sim or controlled by the sim, but they are visible in SPAD.neXt and you can do things with them. So we've got two BU0836X interfaces. Those are Leo Bodnar cards. If you don't know who Leo Bodnar is, then I suggest you go and Google, because he makes very useful devices for cockpit builders which allow you to connect switches and LEDs and rotary encoders through a standard game controller interface which looks to Windows like a game controller or joystick. And for controlling things directly in the sim, that's super useful. But you can control all these things in SPAD.neXt as well. It's recognised my PFC Cirrus yoke, my side stick, the A320 Thrustmaster. Apologies to Throttletech, well, and Thrustmaster. My Throttletech custom throttle quadrant. Actually, the hardware for that is a Leo Bodnar card. It's just got a custom name, so I've got 3 Leo Bodnar cards in my machine. My T-pendular rudder, my rudder pedals, and my Virtual Fly TQ6, which I mentioned in a previous video. And they all work pretty much the same way with some minor differences. For example, the yoke here, you can see there are some axes listed because it has axes as well as buttons. The same for the A320. In fact, the same for everything really, apart from the Bodnar interfaces. They all have some axes. The T-pendular rudder just has axes, no buttons. Whereas the Bodnar interface, you can see it has a hat switch. In fact, it has multiple hat switches. but it doesn't have any axes, but it does have buttons. So in order to customize the behavior, you need to click on the relevant thing. So in this case, let's click on button number 7. Well, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually touch the real device that's connected to this interface. So it's the little numeric keypad that's mounted on the front of my instrument panel. So if I press the 0 button, you can see that's mapped actually to joystick button number 15 on the device. And you can actually see that's bound to a command. So there's an event there which says when the button is pressed for a short time, so just basic press, then it's going to press and release key D0. So this is a keyboard mapping for 50 milliseconds. And what I've done is basically set up that keypad so that it generates the relevant numeric keypad presses in the sim. It's as simple as that. And if I went to, for example, the 7 button there, you can see it's pressing D7 and so on and so forth. Let's look at how axes are mapped, because that's an important thing. So if we click on with a Cirrus yoke, if I move it around a bit, you can see those two axes moving. The throttle axis is actually unused, so I won't need to touch that. But the x-axis is my ailerons, and the y-axis is my elevators. And you can see that they're not quite balanced, but that's fine. So these are actually mapped through the sim at the moment, so I'm not mapping them through SPAD.neXt, but if I wanted to, I could, and I could do some fairly sophisticated behavior. Now, I do think that the FSUIPC axis mapping and possibly the joystick button mapping is a little bit better generally, but there are some things that you can only do with SPAD.neXt that you can't do with FSUIPC. In particular, the response curve control is much more granular with SPAD.neXt, but there are a couple of other bells and whistles. So let me select the x-axis there, and just like everywhere else, you've got the same model of events. In this case, events are actually axes, so you can pick a custom axis, a standard axis, or once again a scripted event. So let's say a standard axis, and now you get to pick which one it's going to be. So in this case, it is my ailerons. And now you get the axis configuration dialog. So first thing you want to do is set the range, of course. With this device, the range is entirely positive. So that's full left, that's full right. Now, what you can see here is that it's expecting full right to be a minus value, so effectively on this side, but this is actually left. So I need to invert the axis. There you go. And now, when I go left, the axis goes right, and vice versa. And my full right position is here, 666. That's not ominous at all. So we'll set that, and we'll bring it to the center, and we'll set that, and then we'll take it full left, and we'll set that. And now it knows what the actual value range is for this axis. And then by default, if I click OK on that, that will just start controlling the ailerons in the sim based on my axis inputs. But since I already have it mapped in the sim, I'm going to say cancel. You can alternatively add a custom axis, and when you do that, you need to select the data point which is going to be adjusted by the axis, and you might need to define a range for it to say only between here and here are we going to do anything, and then you might need to rescale the output value to something else. You can directly use the axis value or the rescaled value. And again, you can invert the axis, and all you do is you select which data you are going to change based on the value of that axis. That's how you map custom axes that it doesn't know about. If we go to the axis configuration dialog, you can calibrate the axis. That looks like this. So this is a pretty standard calibration dialog, but you can set the range by calibrating it. You can smooth that. If you've got a jumpy potentiometer, for example, which tends to flicker between values, you can smooth that out and potentially stop it from doing that. Obviously, the smoother you make the axis, then the less responsive the axis will be. So you don't really want to do it unless you have to. You can set a dead zone. That's pretty common functionality, and you can set the minimum delta if you've used FSUIPC. That's the same deal. That basically sets the minimum amount of change beyond which it will actually respond. So if you're finding for example, that your axis is too sensitive, then you could increase the minimum delta and actually make it less so. Let's close that. By the way, I apologise for my slightly stuffy voice today. I am having a little bit of a hay fever day, and the fact that it's overcast and windy is not helping. So the other thing you can do here is you can edit the response curve, and I mentioned that this is much more precise than you can do in FSUI PC, and it really is. So at any point along the curve you can amend it pretty much however you want. So if I exercise the axis, you can see that line moving around. So for example, if I wanted it to respond more sharply on the right, then I could do that. So for example, if I were to move over here and click there, you can see that the curve moves, and if I then wanted it to go back to kind of normal later on, I could do that. And now when we move it, you can see that it well, actually it doesn't go far enough to go right around the curve, but you get the idea. So that's translating your input into a relevant output, and if you've got, for example, unmatched potentiometers on a throttle quadrant, that's a good way of smoothing that stuff out. And in fact, I am going to experiment with this around the reversers on my virtual fly throttle quadrant, because those are not working very well in the sim at the moment. Right, so that's how you configure axes, and if a device has an axis, then that's that will be available to you. The hat switch configuration is actually pretty straightforward. You just add an event, and then you decide which direction you want it to have been pressed in order to do something. So if you've got a hat switch and you want to map it to different views, for example, you could do that through there. And then when you want to map a button, very simple, as say you just you click on the button name and you add an event. Now, I did talk about rotary encoders very briefly earlier on, and the Leo Bodnar cards are capable of dealing with rotary encoders. So normally each of the ports on the card is just an open-close switch, so it simulates a joystick switch. But if you want to connect a rotary encoder, you can do that. And in fact, if I go to the second device here, which is on my my custom radio panel, and I actually move the rotary encoder, you'll see as I move it, that number 11 button is blipping. That's moving it to the right. To the left, the 12 is blipping. If I move the top part of the encoder to the right, then 9 is going, and to the left, 10 is going. In order to set that up, you need to download some software from the Bodnar website. There's a little custom piece of software which resets the settings on the board and will tell it that certain ports are to be treated as encoder ports, and then they will behave that way. But from your perspective in SPAD.neXt, it just looks like a joystick button press. So it looks like the joystick button is pressed and then released, and then I'm able to map that, for example, to radio frequency. You can see in this case it's actually moving the autopilot controls, because I had it set up custom for MSFS in a slightly earlier incarnation before I got a bit more control over the autopilot before I actually bought the Simionic setup. So that's why those are like that. But in my older sim, I had those changing various different radio frequencies as an example. But that's pretty easy to do. So that is your controller section, and then we're into some more custom stuff. So FIPs, this will only appear if you've enabled the FIP functionality. What is FIP? Well, FIP is the Saitek Flight Information Panel, and these are these little devices here, which I used to own a few of, but now no longer have, and they have a small LCD screen on, some buttons, and they could be used to display a particular gauge. You could download gauges from various different websites and run them on the FIP, and SPAD.neXt adds the capability to run these FIP gauges, and also newer gauges would only work with SPAD.neXt. They wouldn't work with the older drivers because they've been built for the newer features. If you have these devices, this is super useful, but you can also have virtual FIPs, and that's what this one is, because I don't have a hardware FIP, but I told it to enable virtual FIPs, and then I added one virtual FIP. And what I can do is configure it with a gauge, and then when the simulation is running, then SPAD.neXt will actually display this in a window that I can then drag around and put on whatever monitor I like. So that's quite a handy little piece of functionality if you have had the hardware devices and you have gauges for them and you've gotten rid of the hardware, or you just want to add additional ones without buying the physical devices because they're still quite hard to get hold of. So that's what the FIPs are for, and that whole section is just for that, and it will only show if you have those things enabled. And now we're getting into kind of the more operational and diagnostic parts of the software, which you would use when you're working out how to custom program things. So the next section here is the add-ons section, and I'm not entirely sure why it's called add-ons, because it seems like a inaccurate name. But basically it's a set of different monitors and ways of managing customizations. So the first page within is the data monitor. This allows you to track a data value or an LVAR value, SimConnect, any kind of value from the connected simulator. I actually do have the simulator running. You might be able to hear the sim music in the background there. And I've had it running all this time, so we're going to demo that in a moment. We've got the event monitor where you can track all the events that are being produced by the sim. It's a bit like a debug monitor, so if I click start, then you start to see these events, and these are just regular events being generated by the sim whilst it's running. As you can see, there's not a lot going on. It's just these potentiometer values are changing for some reason. I don't want to track these, I don't want to see them, so you can get rid of particular events by clicking there. If I just keep clicking at the top, then eventually all those events will go away, and then I'll only see other events that I'm interested in. In fact, if I bring the sim up momentarily, you see we're actually on the world map, which is why you're not seeing anything particular. But if we go into the world map and we go to, I'm just going to go to London City. I'm in the TBM, yeah, we'll just go in like that. And we'll leave that to get on with that. If I can get my cursor back, where's my cursor gone? Oh, there it is. Oops. Right. So you'll now see like events like sim start are coming through, indicating the sim is doing stuff, which is quite handy. And once it actually goes into ready to fly mode, you're going to see a whole explosion of events there. So it's slightly more difficult to pin down an individual event that you care about, but you can do. It's just you need to spend a lot of time disabling the events that you're not interested in until you can just reach the ones that you are. And then you can operate controls and you can do things in the sim and see which events are produced, and that will clue you into which things you need to hook up to or which data values you need to read in order to achieve your goals in the sim. Let's just see how it's doing. Nearly there, I think.
City Tower Ghost 1
there you go.
Runway 27 ready for
Let's
departure.
just see
Straight out departure.
what it's doing. Yeah, there you are. You can see lots of events. We hit ready to fly. Now the weather is better than it was earlier. Get rid of that master warning. So lots and lots of events going on there. So I'm just going to delete most of these. There we go. So for example, if I wanted to track and see what event was happening when I open and close fuel valves, I could do that. So I could close the fuel valve using, I've already got a switch wired up to it. I could use that to close the fuel valve, or I could do it in the sim, or you know, for example, I could go to the sim and get rid of that master caution. Did that generate an event? It might have done, but it was probably one that I hadn't seen before. But I could go up to, oops, there we go. I could, for example, switch the fuel selector to manual. I imagine that might have triggered an event. Yeah, there you go, fuel selector set. So that then tells me that that's the event I'm looking for if I'm interested in controlling this. So that's what the event log is pretty useful for. The data monitor, similarly, you can add any data value. So I can add literally all the LVARs from this aircraft in one click, and you can see what they all are. So for example, the EFD brightness is currently 0. Landing gear lights are blinking, you can see that going on. So you could spend quite a lot of time analysing this stuff and understanding what these things did. Or if you know explicitly which thing you're looking for, you can add a particular data point. So we could look at the electrical battery voltage, which at the moment is 24 because the engine is on. And you know, you could in theory change that, so I could change that to 23. It goes straight back to 24 because obviously the sim is setting it, but you can edit things straight there if you want to experiment with it and see what they do. You can add the locals. Locals are variables that you create in the individual profile. So this, for example, is a variable that I added to track the status of the panel lights, and when the panel lights turn on and off, that variable is flipped, and I use that for something else. You can add SimConnect variables specifically by name, if you know what the name is, and you can add all used data, literally everything that's currently in use at the moment, and you can see that's an awful lot of stuff. Let's just clear all that stuff out. So that's really very useful. The expressions tab. Expressions are useful for when you're creating your own scripts. I don't use them, I don't really know that much about it, so I'm not going to pretend that I do. But you can add an expression, give it a name, say what the scope is, you can add a piece of data, and basically the expression it seems to be like a nickname for a piece of data. I guess if you're using it in scripts, then it's easier to do it that way. Scripting itself, now that's not the same as scripted events, I want to be clear about that. This is the plugin functionality for SPAD.neXt. And it's a relatively limited system, and in order to use it, you would need to be a programmer and you would need to know how to use C#, which is the programming language for the .NET framework in which SPAD.neXt is actually written. But you can add a script by finding a script file you've written, which would be a .cs script file. I know how to do C#, it's actually the language I use at work every day, but my attempts to create plugins have not gone very well, because unlike a normal plugin architecture where you would create your own program and then compile it into a library and then add that library into the software, SPAD.neXt does something a little bit different. You actually give it the raw source code for your script and it compiles it on the fly, which means that you only have access to the various libraries that SPAD has decided to add by default for you, and you don't seem to be able to add anymore. So I found it just wasn't capable of doing what I wanted. But for basic customization, where you just want to play around with the internal state of SPAD, then it's very good. And there's some documentation on the SPAD.neXt website and on their forum. There's a GitHub page where you can download the SDK for this stuff if that is your bag. Let's get out of that. Client events. So this is where you can set up events based on SimConnect events which have been added in. They're not native SimConnect events. So remember that it has a list of all the different events, it knows about them. This basically adds those to this list and then to that list and maps them to a particular event. So in this case, I have a whole bunch of stuff added and mapped to the MobiFlight events that are added by their WASM module to control the G1000 and G3000. So it adds a lot of control that's not in the basic SimConnect setup. Virtual devices, this is where the VFIPs are kept. I'm actually going to delete that one because I don't need it. But you can have one from there, and that's the only virtual device type that I'm aware of right now. And then the debug monitor, I believe this will actually display stuff from the debug log for the program. So I can't see any reason why you need to do this unless you were literally debugging your own profile, your own script. So again, I've never touched this. And that is the add-on section. Right, let's just go back into the sim for a second. That frame rate's not great, mind you. It is London City, and we're on pretty high settings, so that does not surprise me. Actually, it's not bad. You can see that SPAD is not having any kind of impact on the sim performance, and it doesn't, so if you're at all worried about that, you really don't need to be. Let's go back to SPAD. So the next section is the settings, and here is where you set things up. So there's a page about your license and registration. I mentioned that individual licenses are locked to particular computers, so when you first install the software you'll be asked for a license code, which you'll put in and it will lock it down. If you need to deactivate the license on this machine to move it somewhere else, that's the button you would use. The update subscription, that is an ongoing payment to get new versions, so you can buy it, use it in perpetuity, but if you want the new major versions you do need to take an additional subscription once your first year subscription, which comes with your basic purchase, has expired. And you can go to their store and buy additional add-ons. I have the complete edition, so I literally have everything, but if you bought just say the MSFS edition, then you could potentially add some other add-ons. I'm not entirely sure actually what add-ons are available. Oh, okay, so we got Explain support. Right, so if you'd bought Explain and you wanted to add MSFS, you could do that for an additional $14.99, or vice versa. Virtual FIP support for €20. Q400 training, remote joystick. Euro Truck Simulator, you can use this software with racing games and Euro Truck Simulator as well. iRacing support. I already have all these things, but those are available add-ons. And that's pretty much everything there. App settings. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of them are important. So you can configure the splash screen, etc. You can tell it which modules you want turned on. So I've turned off the iFly support, the iRacing support, the Euro Truck Simulator. These are, I don't have the Majestic Dash 8 installed on this machine, so I don't have that support on. I've just got the bits that I need. You can do that there. Profile settings just controls whether or not it will change the profile when you load a new aircraft in the sim. The expert settings, a few of those are useful. You can subscribe to their beta channel if you want to get beta releases. I'm not entirely sure what expert mode does. Network installation, that's if you want to install SPAD.neXt on another machine but have it control devices on a different machine, you can do that. If you have a multi-channel setup, that could be quite useful. Yeah, the rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. And then finally there's just a quick dialogue for MSFS specifically, so you can tell it where it can find aircraft. So I've just pointed it at the packages folder because that's where they all are. I think that includes, all of them. If you were putting aircraft in your community folder, then you'd need to add the path into the community folder where your aircraft were installed. Directories just points SPAD.neXt at the places where it should put stuff. I generally leave that as a default. Config wizard, this runs when you first install the software, so just let it run, but you can rerun it if you need to. The LVAR bridge is a piece of software. There's one for P3D, FSX, one for MSFS, and one for Explain. Actually, I'm not sure Explain has it because Explain doesn't really have LVARs, but anyway. This is what allows you to read and set LVARs in the sim. Without that, it doesn't work. So you just need to make sure it's installed if for whatever reason. Occasionally it goes out of date and you have to update it. This is just a button to let you install it if you haven't done yet. Devices page lets you turn on and off different device support. I don't really bother unless I need to turn something specifically off, but you can see here's an example of the stuff it knows about by default. So it knows about the Stream Deck, that's really the newest thing they've added. You can turn the MIDI support, the script panel support on and off. It knows about GoFlights modules, it knows about the OpenCockpit modules, it knows the various different Saitek panels and controls, which given its origin is a no-brainer. It can know about serial devices, so if you've got like a USB serial device you can control it from there. I might try and control my my lights from SPAD.neXt at some point rather than having a separate piece of software to do it. I have no idea what the Ultimark pack drive is. Apparently it's an LED controller. Virtual avionics devices and VR Insight devices, so pretty good support. And I guess if you wanted to get support for a new device type, then you could probably go and talk to the author of the program and see if he would do it, or if there was a way you could do it as a third party. Appearance just lets you change the colour and the theme. and then there's a credit page for all the third-party licenses, and that's that whole section. And then last but not least is the support section. Now it's not something I really use, but this connects you with their support system and lets you manage your support tickets directly in the application. It's going to take ages to actually read the tickets. I find it's very, very slow, so that's one of the reasons that I don't use it. Well, actually, no, it's not too bad. You can see I've only really got two tickets, which are quite old and have been mostly closed. And that's kind of it for the various different sections. There's just these two little buttons here. When you've made a change, this one will go red, and you need to click it to save the profile. And this one says enable disable programming mode, and I have absolutely no idea what that means. None at all. I'm sure it's in the documentation. And that's it. That's SPAD.neXt. Now, hopefully you can see the potential this thing has for home cockpit setups. It's absolutely essential. I could not have done what I did with my old setup and even with the current setup without this software, so it's absolutely a must purchase, just along with FSUI PC, and they do play together quite nicely. It actually has all the FSUI PC settings, and it knows how to press FSUI PC virtual joystick buttons, for example, so the two programs do work well together. One is not a replacement for the other, and I guess a well tooled out sim will need both. But if you have any particular questions about SPAD.neXt, I wouldn't recommend putting them in the comments of the video here, just because I'm not really an expert, but go to the SPAD website, go to the forum, there's lots of knowledgeable people there. But if you just have very general questions about how I use it, then feel free to leave those in the comments of the video below, and I will try and answer those as quickly as I can. But otherwise, I think that's the end of the video. So, as always, thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. Probably more useful than the last video. Once again, I cannot promise when the next video is going to be. I was inspired to do this today, and I had the time, so I did. And it was easy for me to do this without needing to have made any progress on the new sim or anything like that, or set up a complicated flight. So, I'm kind of winging it at this point. But the next video is likely to be either another flight video or possibly, finally, an update on the new sim project. I am hoping to get into a bit more work in the build room fairly soon, and start looking again at the projectors versus TVs question, potentially doing some experimentation to visualize what that would look like. So you can look out for that. If you want to subscribe to the channel and you haven't already, then of course, as always, I would welcome that. But if you do, please click the bell icon, because not only does it help the channel, but also you will know when I publish a video. And as always, the schedule here is erratic. If you like the video, please hit the like button. It does help. If you disliked it, please hit the dislike button. All honest opinions are very valued. And with that, I'll say thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you back on the channel very soon.